Super Mario Sunshine makes me question whether or not it's even fair to label a game as good or bad. That's how confusing this game is to me. In the beginning of this game, you fight this boss 3 times, each more mind-numbingly boring than the last. However, later in this game, you fight a boss that takes advantage of this game's mechanics in a brilliant way. You get these awful platforming sections, but you also get these great chase sequences with Shadow Mario. The whole game is like this. There are dozens of fantastic sections and equally terrible ones. So let's imagine for a second you did the impossible. You broke the mold. You made something no one else has. What would you do next? Would you safely build upon that idea in an attempt to recapture the magic? Or would you give Mario a Super Soaker? Nintendo chose the second option, of course, and that's why we're here. Now, I'm not here to compare Mario 64 to Sunshine. I think 64 is a much more consistent game, but I think Sunshine is more interesting to look at because of its ups and downs. In a lot of ways, this is the best 3D Mario game, and in just as many ways, it's the worst 3D Mario game. Nintendo took a big risk with this one, and honestly, I respect that a lot. So, where better to start than with the central gimmick of this game? So every game has its own unique special mechanic that makes it different from its peers. It can be something simple like Celeste's dash ability, or it can be more abstract like Okami's paintbrush. But most games have that one key gimmick that the rest of the game is designed around. So of course, Sunshine has one of these as well. Sunshine has FLUDD. FLUDD presents dozens of new opportunities for platforming, level design, and even enemy design. I think it's thanks to FLUDD and a few other things that I'll get to later that this game is so much fun to play. FLUDD allows for new options, and I think that's incredibly important in a game like this. It prevents the game from getting stale. With the help of FLUDD, you can build levels that aren't just about jumping from point A to point B. Now they're about how FLUDD can interact with enemies, platforms, and other gimmicks in the levels. This adds a totally new level of depth to the game and is, in my opinion, one of the best mechanics in any 3D Mario game. But it's not all positive. FLUDD isn't perfect. One of the main complaints I've seen about this game is that FLUDD trivializes a lot of the platforming challenges, and honestly it's true. To understand why, we need to talk about course correction. In Mario 64, you can kick midair to adjust your trajectory. In Galaxy, you can spin. In Celeste, you can dash. The list goes on. Nearly every 3D platformer, and even a lot of 2D platformers, have this course correction. It's not a necessary mechanic though. If your game is all about hyper-precise movements and jumps, it's fine to not have it. But the big caveat here is your game has to be airtight. So what's the problem with FLUDD then? It's not like this game is some hyper-precise platformer, right? Well, no, it's not, most of the time. But the issue here is, the course correction can go a bit too far. Think about it. What if there was a game where the objective was to go from point A to point B, but every single stage in the game was just a straight line? That wouldn't be a fun game to play because there's no challenge. You're not learning anything, you don't have to think, you simply hold forwards and win. Obviously this is an extreme example, but it shows that when you remove too much difficulty, the game becomes boring. That's sort of what happens here. Not all the time, mind you, but oftentimes FLUDD can trivialize a lot of the platforming. That said, it's a good thing FLUDD is in this game, because when they remove FLUDD, it gets rough. We'll get to that. But there's one last aspect of FLUDD I want to talk about. As the game progresses, you gain access to alternate nozzles that replace the hover nozzle. These are super fun. The rocket nozzle shoots you into the air, hence the name, and the turbo nozzle turns this into a Sonic game. There's this one stage that uses the turbo nozzle. It's a super simple stage, but I really wish we got more levels like this. I do think the nozzles could have been a bit better though. For example, imagine if you were given access to all of them at once. You see, when you gain a new nozzle, it replaces the hover nozzle. But if you could use all 4, there could be unique platforming challenges that require you to use all 4 back to back. Something like this section in the mountain with a name I don't want to say because YouTube might get mad at me. These platforms require you to quickly switch between the hover nozzle and the spray nozzle to complete the section. This was so much fun, and I really wish there was more of this in this game. But enough about FLUDD. I mentioned this before, but this game sometimes takes FLUDD away. So let's talk about that. So remember when I said this? But the big caveat here is your game has to be airtight. Well, unfortunately for any human being playing this game, it's not. In fact, it can be a bit hard to play sometimes. I want to start with the secret stages as they're the most egregious example of this awful clunkiness. So I'm of the opinion these stages are bad. Shocking, I know. Let me explain why. If you somehow didn't know already, special stages remove FLUDD and force you to do some platforming. It's a really cool idea in theory, but in practice it just doesn't work. See, the whole game actually feels like you're on ice, but that doesn't really matter most of the time since you have FLUDD and you're not over a bottomless pit. But in these special stages, that problem gets magnified. Remember before when I talked about course correction? Well yeah, that doesn't exist here. So you're forced to take your life in your hands every single time you jump. Combine that with the fact that you're on ice, and it just falls apart. These stages are the worst type of challenge, where the difficulty comes from the fact that you have so little control over Mario. It's a clunky, slippery mess, and you know what? Hang on. There we go. Got it. Check this out. So this is one of my favorite games. It's called Celeste. The stage you're looking at right now is one of the hardest challenges in the game. This is the perfect type of difficulty. Every single time I fail here, it's my fault, and I know exactly why I died. In high difficulty situations like this, it is so important to understand what you're doing wrong so you can improve and master it. More than anything, these sections in Sunshine are annoying, not hard. Now, I would be lying if I said finishing them wasn't satisfying, but it's more of a relief that your suffering has finally come to an end than a genuine feeling of accomplishment. Now, I'd also like to spend some time talking about the positives of movement in this game. It's actually not all bad. The overall movement is pretty solid. It's honestly one of the best movement systems of any 3D Mario game. And nothing better exemplifies this than Shadow Mario. You see, Shadow Mario doesn't have FLUDD. All he has is skill. But outside of FLUDD, he's got all the same moves you do. This means if you don't want to, you don't have to use FLUDD to keep up with him. It's so much fun to chase him around and mirror his moves as he does them. That leads into another thing about the movement of this game. This game has the side flip, the triple jump, and the spin jump. These three work together beautifully with FLUDD to allow you to find your own path through levels. These levels are the perfect duration too, and I really did enjoy most of them. All in all, I think this is some of the most enjoyable movement in any 3D Mario game. Okay, that's all for platforming. Let's talk about bosses. Spoiler, they're... Just like every other aspect of this game, the bosses range from great to terrible. I mentioned this in the beginning, but you refight bosses very often. It's not a super big deal since it only really happens in the early game, but I do wonder if this game would be better off just having removed some of these encounters. Take the squid at the top of this area, for example. If you just remove this boss, you still have a solid level where you make your way to the top of this cliff before the platforms you're jumping on disappear. It's honestly a really cool level, but the fight at the end is just unneeded. Another issue with bosses in this game is they're rarely engaging. The plant is the best example of this. After the first phase, you know exactly how to beat this boss, but it doesn't get any more interesting. Most of this fight is spent waiting, and it's not exclusive to the plant. King Boo's fight is just awful. This fight has everyone's favorite game mechanics, waiting and RNG. Wait for the roulette wheel, hope it lands on fruit, waste your time fighting enemies if it doesn't. Now this fight isn't totally random, it actually does have a set pattern. Basically you just can't get fruit twice in a row, but unfortunately you can get things that aren't fruit multiple times in a row. There's just so much forced waiting in this fight, and by the time you figure out how to win, you've still got about 80% of the fight to go. And tragically, it's not just these two. Most of the fights in this game are spent just waiting. Wait for Petey Piranha to stop flying, wait for the plant to open its mouth, wait for King Boo to throw fruit, wait for these painfully slow fights to just end. Now granted, not every single boss fight is terrible. Mecha Bowser is actually a pretty exhilarating fight. You grab these rockets along the track and shoot them at him. There's a lot of waiting in this fight too, but there's never really any downtime. See, these bullet bills are constantly chasing after you, and you have to spray them to avoid getting hit. This is an overall really fun fight. The Wiggler is a fun fight too. It's one of the first examples of FLUDD being used in a really cool, unique way. These plants make the sand pop up when you spray them, so you have to spray them just before the rampaging Wiggler hits you to topple him. And of course, there's the final Bowser fight. I liked this fight a lot. You have to rocket yourself into the air and then ground pound these targets before the bullet bills hit you. You also have to avoid Bowser's fire, and after you hit a target, you have to avoid the splashing water. There's just a lot going on in this fight, and you're constantly on the move. I honestly really enjoyed it, especially when compared to most other fights in this game. So I hope you see what I mean now when I say I struggle to call this game bad. It's just so hard to say this game is terrible because of the Manta Ray fight when the Mecha Bowser fight exists, or that the platforming is a clunky mess when Shadow Mario is right there, or that FLUDD trivializes the game when unique platforming opportunities and alternate nozzles exist. So while I can't tell you if this game is good or bad, at the very least I'll tell you this. I respect and appreciate this game a lot for simply going out of its way to try something new. You can't progress unless you're willing to try something like this, And so few games are. I mean, just look at Pokemon. I loved playing Sunshine as a kid because of all the quirky, eccentric ideas, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit of that magic playing this game as an adult. So sure, it messes up a lot. But when this game is at its best, it doesn't just shine. It's sun. Yeah, there is no way I'm letting that finish. Anyway, you can check out this video on one of the best games ever made that you probably haven't played yet.